Chaos Terminators, Terminators of Chaos, the old Metal Chaos Terminators. In this video, I'll paint them up for your pleasure and discuss their rules for 2nd edition 40k. In my last video, I painted up Abaddon the Despoiler. Go have a look if you dig his shtick. One of the special rules for Abaddon is the ability to take a bodyguard of Terminators, so it seemed fitting that my next flirtation with the Servants of Chaos would be to assemble and paint some era-appropriate Chaos Terminators in order to escort their lord into battle. I chose to work on a batch of 5 of these models, which I obtained second-hand from eBay, since if years of being in the 40k hobby has done nothing else for me, it has conditioned me to build my units in staples of 5. But more on the unit size later. For now, let's have a look at the models. The models I am using were released in 1996, the same year as Codex Chaos was released. Such models were available in a box set of 5 Terminators, or in blister packs. A few years later, the same miniatures were repackaged for 3rd edition. The pages of this Citadel Annual show the variety of bits available for these models: 3 body sculpts, 5 heads, and 4 trophy racks. All right arms carried ranged weapons. These were 2 combi bolter sculpts, a bolter and flamer combi weapon, a bolter and melter combi weapon, a reaper autocannon, and of course the flamer. Sorry, I meant the heavy flamer. All left arms came with a melee weapon, either a chain axe, power fist, power mace, or a middle finger flipping the bird chain fist. The only part here I do not have is the heavy flamer, but never mind. Citadel also produced a Chaos Champion in Terminator armor, but this is something I do not currently own. So, the lot I bought had 6 models in it, but I have only parts to make 5 complete Terminators. I don't know what I'll do with the other parts. Maybe I'll convert my own Chaos Champion later. Anyway, after stripping them with acetone, I cleaned off the mold lines, which is like wading through treacle, and then I began grouping them according to how I would build them. One thing to point out here is the presence of blades and chainsaws on the combi weapons. In 2nd edition, these were for more than just decoration. The rules stated that such weapons allowed the bearer +1 attack in close combat, unless they had fired the ranged component during Overwatch or in the shooting phase. I didn't really have a plan for their loadouts. I just went with what I thought looked cool. These aren't models for meta chasing. They are for casual games of 2nd edition, or maybe 3rd edition 40k, because, believe it or not, I think there is some merit in playing old rule sets, or even rules not published by GW. I don't have to play the latest edition if I don't want to, and that justifies why I have used 25mm bases, a fact that clearly upsets some people. Are the Terminators too large for these bases? Certainly, but 25mm was the base size at the time, and that's why I am choosing them, for an authentic retro look. Had I wished to use them in the latest edition of 40k, I would base them accordingly, but I don't, so I haven't. Anyway, let's say nothing more of this. Assembly was made somewhat easier on these models by the studs on the torso and the holes on the arms, and this helped since metal models are notorious for falling apart. Case in point, Abaddon and his arm with the Talon of Horus. Also, the heads each possessed a stud to slot them into the torso part. Nevertheless, I sanded down the areas which would be glued together first, to increase the surface area for the superglue to grip onto. Now each model needs 2 trophy racks, because which self-respecting veteran of the Long War would not want to carry the skulls of his foes into battle with him, and his grandma's curtain tiebacks? When assembling the trophy racks, it's important to A. know your right from your left, and B. be able to pair these up in opposing pairs. The L and R letters engraved on each bit aids with the latter. As for the former, well, had these racks not been engraved as they are, I would have thought they would need to be paired up with another of the same type. 2 horns, for example, like a heretical game of memory. But no, it seemed to be the case that one of them must bear this censer, and the other a horn, or a cute little gargoyle face. The first stage of assembly was to glue the torsos to their 1992 slaughter bases. Superglue is the adhesive of choice here, but if you do it right, you can actually forego the glue entirely. The trick is to bend the slaughter base a little to form a pressure fit. Of course, I still apply a little glue just in case. I won't bore you with the bit-by-bit assembly, but I chose the power mace for the guy with no helmet since I figured he was the kind of guy who would prefer his naked eyes to gaze upon his foes while he cracked their skulls with his silly power club. The other conscious choice was to give the big tusk guy the biggest gun, namely the Reaper autocannon, because you know what they say about big tusks? Big guns? No? Anyway, here's the squad fully assembled in all their dense, spiky glory. More than once did I almost lacerate my baby soft skin with their pointy assets, but they are not ready for priming yet. Some models don't quite cover the holes in the slaughter bases, but I solved this problem by mixing some milliput to fill the gaps, pressing it into place with the pointy end of a bamboo skewer, which I was saving in case I wanted to make some of the old alien cacti scenery. I decided to add the basing material, you know where it's from, to the base before priming. I painted on some PVA glue, dipped it in sand, and tapped off the excess. Time for the prime, which was Colourforge matte black. I used double-sided tape to hold the models onto my painting handle of choice, which was a pickled gherkin jar.
Banksy, everyone!
When all the models got a solid overall coat of black, it was time for the base coat, which is not the same colour black. I always say that when painting black armour, you're actually painting it a shade of grey, or several in this case, but definitely not 50. So, I mixed together Thunderhawk blue with black to give the first grey. The blue aspect is important to give a more interesting shade than would be achieved with just white and black. I carefully painted the middle of the armour panels, whether they be on the middle of the power fist or the backs of the legs. In many cases, I didn't paint to the edge of this section in order to leave the undercoat showing, which works as the darkest colour, and therefore a shade in the recesses. I'm demonstrating the detailed paint job on one model, but I repeated the procedure for all of them. I repeated this process on the helmet, wiping most of the paint off my brush so I could overbrush the details and avoid getting grey in the recesses. I then dabbed some of this grey on the shafts of his trophy rack. With pure Thunderhawk blue, I began the first stage of highlighting, picking out all the sharp edges I previously painted grey, including the edges of the helmet, his cheek guard, and his belt, and any other such places. On the backs of the legs, I lined in Thunderhawk blue at the edges, as well as on the spikes and rims around the front of the legs and the power fist. While this blue was on my palette, I dabbed on the next layer of texture on the trophy rack shafts, and then painted the ridges of his under armour. Here and there, I painted on a line to show a scratch in the armour. The next colour was Fenrisian Grey, which is a great bedfellow to Thunderhawk Blue. With this, I lined the same areas I went over previously, keeping my lines as sharp as I could manage to maximise the poppage. Likewise, I painted a line of Fenrisian Grey along the scratches I did beforehand. I highlighted some of the bolter casing this way as well, since apart from the gold, the casing would be black like his armour. And his heart! And here's what he looks like with all the greys finished on the armour. As you can see, I prefer to paint the base coat entirely, basing and highlighting, before I move on to any other area. However, for the other sections, I tend to skip around between colours, particularly where I am waiting for paint to dry. The next area then is the rims of the shoulder pads and armour. These are the riveted sections that will be painted gold. I base these with thinned Vallejo flat brown to begin with, since gold in my opinion looks better over brown than it does over black. I also paint the tusks and the skulls this colour too, but these will not be gold. The knee pads get the brown treatment, as does this whopping skull on the left shoulder pad, parts of the bolter, the braces on the leg armour, and his groin arrow. What actually is this thing pointing to? And here's where we're at this step. So, it's time for the gold. And this goes wherever there was brown, except if I'm going to paint it bone colour, in the case of the skulls on the trophy rack and any tusks and horns. My choice of gold paint is Dwarven Gold by Metal and Alchemy. This pot is a couple of years old by now, so I'm not sure if the recipe is still the same. I say this because people have told me they have had bad results with this particular one, although I've always found it goes on fine. And while we're painting this, let's not forget the groin arrow. And that's all the gold done. An internet browse for how others have painted Black Legion actually gives quite a variety. For instance, some people use gunmetal for the rims, where I've chosen to use gold. And for the pipes and some other detail, they have used yellow. But that didn't scratch an itch for me. I decided to go with a more limited palette this time, which was mainly 3 colours: black, gold and red. Of course there would be others, but these 3 would be the most prominent. So with that in mind, I began painting the fingers of the Power Fist corn red. The chainsaw case was also painted this colour, along with the pipes and the curtain tassels. 2 coats of this was enough to give a solid base for the next red. But before I did this, I washed the red and gold areas with Reichland Flesh Shade, pushing the wash into the deeper recesses and pulling it away from the raised areas. I avoided the large flat areas of red, for example on the chainsaw, choosing to focus on where there was a transition between details. And here's the model with all the shading. The next step was this Vallejo Dark Vermilion, which I used to brighten up all the red areas. I mixed this with a drop of this flow improver to thin the paint without getting any colour shift, just like the bottle states. It also gives a lovely matte finish. This red went on the chainsaw and the fingers, but on the pipes and tassels, I used smaller amounts of paint with less thinning so it stayed on the raised areas. Wonderful. The red is looking so much more vibrant now. I find a base coat of corn red first allows for this vibrancy instead of painting the vermilion straight onto the black. I suppose I could paint it white over the black first, but this never looks good in my opinion. I know there's other methods, but I'm fine with this one. And the corn red in the recesses shows some shading. I fancied cracking out the gunmetal next, and this went on the spikes on the trophy racks, the bolter barrel, the chainsaw teeth, and any chains that were showing. Turning my attention to the horn protruding from the trophy rack, I had already base coated this flat brown, so the next thing to do was to paint it Vallejo Tan Earth. But I did this more intentionally, painting along thin triangles to leave some of the previous coat showing beneath. I then repeated this process with dark sand and finally white, making the triangles shorter with each pass. I suppose I was trying to follow this example in this old book, How to Paint Citadel Miniatures. It's possibly one of the coolest books I own, and a top resource for painting tips and inspiration. Sadly though, it's long out of print. When it comes to the tusks, I use the same paints in the same order, but using thin vertical lines of varying thickness. In addition, I use dark sand and white to highlight the uppermost edges of the tusks. The same palette is used on the skulls as well, tan earth first, then dark sand on the uppermost parts, followed by white highlights here and there. I do confess, some of these parts were tricky to film and paint, so forgive me for any footage which is unclear. Back to the reds, and I used Troll Slayer Orange for the first highlight, lining the edges of the chainsaw and the fingertips on the Power Fist. This isn't the final highlight, but I'd like to say at this stage, I think it looks better to line in this way, to provide more contrast between the metallic and non-metallic areas. I can't say I do it consistently, just where I think it's most noticeable. The second highlight on this red is Barbarian Flesh from Army Painter, but you could use any similar flesh colour. This choice of highlight is something I've discussed in previous videos, so go watch them all I suppose. And this is our chap so far. I think I'd call this tabletop ready. but I rarely settle for tabletop ready in a paint job. The majority of the work to do now is a few fine details. I paint the bolt gun cartridges vermin brown, and the magazine belt a dark grey and highlighted with Fenrisian grey. Now, the model you have seen me painting so far was actually the test model to hone the technique before I unleashed it on the others. For the next set of models, I decided to experiment on the armour using a bit of sponging. To this end, I fashioned this sponging device, and I cannot claim to have invented this. I probably saw it on Instagram somewhere. Anyway, I tear off a corner of this kitchen sponge and push it through this plastic tube so some of it is protruding from one end. The tube I used was an old paintbrush protector, but any small tube will suffice, even a drink straw for instance. I used this sponge to dab on some Thunderhawk blue, followed by Fenrisian grey, to give the appearance of texture on the flat surfaces of the armour, texture such as chips and grazes that will have accrued on this ancient armour over a millennia of warfare. Before we continue with the painting, I did promise you a brief discussion of the rules, so here goes. The Codex entry lists Chaos Terminators at 51 points per model, which is just over double the price of a normal Chaos Space Marine. Their profile is mostly the same as a regular Legionary, with +1 to weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative and leadership. The main cost is of course the Terminator armour, which affords a 3+ save on 2d6, and the war gear, which is a combi bolter and a chain axe as standard, though, unlike Imperial Terminator armour, it doesn't have targeters and teleport homers. Age is the excuse given for this. 2 models in the squad can take Terminator heavy weapons, and anyone can replace their combi bolter with a combi melter or combi flamer. Any number may replace their chain axe with a Terminator assault weapon. Their choices then are a power mace, or power fist, or a chain fist, you know, the one with the big middle finger. While heavy weapons can either be the Reaper autocannon or the flamer. Sorry, I meant the heavy flamer. The Reaper autocannon is worth another look here, since it had a strong reputation in this rule set, from people I've spoken to anyway. Along with its 40-inch range, it has a strength of 8, d6 damage, and a -3 save throw modifier. Moreover, it uses 2 sustained fire dice, and may reroll one of these per shooting action. This reduces the chance of a jam, of course. So, that's 2 to 6 hits, strength 8, d6 damage each. I'll be sure to use one the next time I fight a Carnifex. Now, if one wishes to, one can upgrade Terminators to a particular Chaos cult. All models in the unit must be of the same cult, and Noise Marines can take noise weapons from the war gear list if they desire. While Abaddon could take up to 4 Terminators in his bodyguard, only 3 were needed for a regular legal squad, up to a maximum of 9, plus an aspiring champion should you wish to take one. That means, with Abaddon and these 5, I could field 2 squads, Abaddon and 2 mates, plus another squad of 3. Anyway, with the test model all but done, I got to work on the other 4. The chain axes get the same red colour scheme as the other melee weapons, since I wanted to stick to the same palette throughout. Now I want to draw your attention to this amazing head sculpt with this rhino horn, which I am highlighting with dark sand, and this amazing new Kalinsky sable brush from my friend Jan, sent all the way from the Czech Republic. Cheers, Jan. Now when it came to painting this power mace, I decided to paint the grip Thunderhawk blue and highlight it with Fenrisian grey. On this chap with the mace, there is an Eye of Horus, so I painted it like the one on Abaddon in the last video. Brown first, then I build up from a dark red to a more saturated one, and finally orange, keeping the lighter shades at the top of the eye. I painted the iris black, though I fumbled here as you can see, so I tidied this up off camera. There was also a thin yellow line around the iris to make it pop. But I'm afraid I broke the rules of my limited palette in other places and applied some War flesh to the handle of this chain axe, a green colour of course, just to add a subtle accent colour. I highlighted these greens with a mix of white and War flesh, nothing fancy. I used a recipe for this chap's face, which was similar to the one for Abaddon. That is, I started with Screamer Pink, and layered on various mixes of barbarian flesh and white and screamer pink, working my way up to a lighter shade. I tried to make his skin colour somewhat pallid, with pink showing in the recesses, you know, for that old, bloodshot, sickly-looking skin. I'm sure life in the Eye of Terror does nothing for the skin, and moisturising with the oil from the skin of Imperial citizens is probably not a reliable substitute. Unlike the abundance of hairstylists in the Eye of Terror, I doubt there's many skin clinicians there. One chap was sporting a combi melter, so after a coat of gunmetal, I painted on some Leviathan blue contrast paint at the end, and then some Leviathan purple wash afterwards, further away from the muzzle. And finally, I dry brushed the end of the muzzle black. The idea here was to simulate heat damage. It's time for decals, and I'm using these relics from the original box. I moisten them with water while applying a layer of microset to the surface of the shoulder pad. I omitted the usual art coat layer just to see the effect. Once the transfer was on the shoulder, I applied some micro salt to allow it to conform to the contours better. When these were dry, I painted on a final layer of matte medium for protection, and to take away the shininess. Every base then got a coat of Vallejo flat earth, followed by a light dusting of tan earth, and then dark sand. And yes, this brush is nearly dead, but it likes its job as the base painting brush. It knows its niche. Leave it alone. I found an old pot of Citadel Foundation Gretchen Green. Remember foundation paints, anyone? Most of mine never dried up, so I used this to paint the base rims. Yeah, now they don't match Abaddon, but I may go back and repaint his base so that they do. I much prefer this muted green for these heretics. I just need to find a modern day equivalent colour if I want to paint many more in this way. I almost forgot to highlight the gold on these guys, which I achieved by sparingly dabbing on some of this not Runefang steel. The last step is to apply a small tuft of static grass to each base using superglue. PVA would have worked as well, but, well, I just wanted to get them done for Instagram, you know? And there we have it. 5 retro metal Terminators of the Black Legion. Abaddon will never stride into battle alone again. I'm really thrilled with how these turned out. Don't they just scream terror and awe? Well, maybe not terror, but surely intimidation at the very least. For some reason, they have me thinking about a biker gang whose motorbikes are actually Transformers. Transformers that morph into their Terminator armor and then grasp around them. Strange, I know, but welcome to my imagination. But keep an eye on the channel for further projects to expand my Chaos Army beyond just Abaddon and his inner circle of dudes. I'm thinking Plague Marines next, but we shall have to see. I know a few of you have asked for a tutorial on Plague Marines, and I intend to deliver, along with a video on how I paint Night Lords. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Do send me some love in the comments if you feel inclined. And if you like what I do, then please check out my Instagram, where I post regularly about my latest projects. And with that, I had better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching.